the difficulty with cars like this is it's such a shame no one can do anything with them. I mean, there's Indy cars rotting all over America. What's up, people? This is a 1997 Reynard Champ car. If it was the year before, it would be considered an Indy car before the split. When it was new, it was the height of American racing. That is when open-wheel cars went, in America, the fastest they ever did, still arguably faster than a new Indy car. And millions of dollars were spent on this car. This silly car, just the rolling chassis, no motor, if I'm not mistaken, back in 1997 was something like $600,000 just to start with. And the amazing thing about it is, in spite of all of the money and engineering, everything that has ever gone into this car, it's just a big stupid paperweight. It takes up space and is basically completely worthless today, with some exception. Now you're going, oh, Casey, what are you talking about? This is a great car. You can run it. It's really fast and vintage race it. All right, that's true. But the thing about it is, one, there's quite a lot of these things littered across the world in America because nobody does anything with them anymore. They require a tremendously high aptitude to work on and engineer, and they also require a tremendously high aptitude to drive. And then you got to find enough people, those that want to get together to drive it. And you can do that in vintage racing, and those cars have a value. It's not millions of dollars, but they have a value. But the problem is this beast requires an insane amount of feeding. What's even more difficult is, oftentimes the engines that were originally used in these, which were small displacement, turbocharged, alcohol-burning monsters, were leased from the manufacturer and went back to the manufacturer. Now, truth be told, a lot of them are just floating around and people actually still have them, and they like to say the public, and they never got back, and you could use it if you found one, but it doesn't. So I think this car, this came to me. You're all going to think I'm crazy. I'm thinking about VTEC swapping it. Yes. Putting in a modern production-based Honda 4-cylinder, that's my mindset. And you guys go, oh, it's going to be stressed. You can't do that. All right, let's back up. Let's talk about this example, and I'll show you why I'm thinking of doing it. So come on in. I'm going to try to pull the bodywork off this by myself without destroying my back. I've already got it disconnected. Now, this particular car is interesting. This was a Mauricio Gugelmin Pac West car. Rather famous, beautiful red, white, and blue livery, and it's just a neat car. I believe that originally ran Mercedes powered. Now, as all you car guys will recognize here, that is not a tiny Mercedes turbocharged engine from back when. That is a small block Chevy derivative. You think, oh, okay, so you've got a small block Chevy in it. All right, no problem. That's going to be cost effective and powerful. It might weigh a little more. Well, you're right in your thinking, but there's a lot of problems with it. Now, let's back up. Why does a car like this have a small block Chevy in it? Well, it wasn't hot rodded out, and it wasn't driven on the street. In the early 1990s, there was a series called the American Indy Car Series. And the rule structure was as such. Have a look here. This is even breathing on individual throttle bodies and has electronic fuel injection. It's actually a really zoomy setup. But in the early 1990s, there was a series called the American Indy Car Series. And it's actually very difficult to find frankly, much information of it on the internet. It was a small series, and you could run older Indy cars like from the 80s, you know, with their Cosworth engines, their turbocharged engines as they were, but you were also allowed to take one of those chassis, typically like a March chassis with Hewland-based internals with a transaxle, and run an alcohol-burning small block Chevy. And they did pretty well. And if you look, sometimes you can still find an old Indy car. Actually, I think there's one out there for sale now. It's rather dilapidated, with an alcohol-burning small block Chevy. And I remember a few years back when Genius Garage first was racing in Indianapolis, in the Brickyard Invitational, there was a gentleman who had, I think like a 1986 March, finished like second Indy 500 with a small block Chevy on alcohol. And he did quite well. And when you have a car like that that's older, you basically have, you know, what is this car? It's a carbon fiber monocoque. It's got suspension, wheels, and tires and brakes, and it's got a transaxle in the back. So if you break it down into its simplest effect, it's just that with some wings and an engine. And people are going, oh, Casey, you're oversimplifying it. No, I'm not. That's basically what cars are. But this one has a lot of problems, which were inherent to trying to make it something that it wasn't. You see, the Indy cars from the 80s and early 90s were a little simpler, okay? You had the monocoque chassis, you have your wings and all that jazz. But the gearboxes, despite being stressed members, had Hewland internals, and they were longitudinal. Like all the gears went this way in the transaxle. And as Indy cars are, if you look over here, there's these starting carts One of them would have the ability to preheat the water and preheat the motor, and the other one has 3 big batteries in series with a giant electric motor that you'd shove in the back to start it. Because these cars were made to be ultimate in speed, ultimate lightweight, so of course you're not going to have an onboard starter. Now, you can't run this in a modern series. It's irrelevant. And the problem is, as it sits, there's been a lot of money spent on this car before we got it to have full VTEC electronics, electronic fuel injection. On gasoline, it was dynoed to 840 horsepower, naturally aspirated at the rear wheels. All that stuff is awesome. But the downsides are, it's overly complex. It's about impossible to work on. So if anything goes wrong, you either have to have tons of spares or you're kind of screwed when you go somewhere. And the other issues come into play with having this big displacement engine. And even though this thing can rev to like 9,000 RPMs, that still pales in consideration to the original engines revving to something like 12 or 14,000 engines back in the day. Which you're saying, oh, no big deal, just gear it differently. You can't gear it differently. This gearbox was designed for high revving motors. And even with the super speedway gearing that would do like, I don't know, 250, 260 miles an hour top speed theoretically on the other engine, this engine doesn't rev high enough to be able to utilize the gears to go as fast as the car can go. So you'll run out of gears. So you could backdate this car to having the Hewlin longitudinal ones from a year before, but then you're basically changing the whole rear half of the car and spending a bunch of money. The other problem with this car is this engine is currently, and I'm air quoting, blown up. And I'll show it to you. This is how you make a $1 million car a paperweight in like 2 seconds. So, and this was not done by me, I have to point out. I don't know if I have the shredded belt. No, I don't. This car has an alternator on it for all the electronics, driven off of a belt from the crank, and it also has a dry sump oil pump driven off a belt from the crank. Well, the dinguses who engineered this part put the what do you call it? The alternator off center a little bit, like misaligned, and you have to split the car in half because all this is stress to get to it. So you think it's all right, so we test it, everything's fine. So what happens? It rolls the alternator belt, shreds it, pops off the oil pump belt. And because it's super complicated, and we had a student looking after it who's new, the warning lights didn't light up. So the car made it what we're guessing approximately 3 turns before lack of oil, and things destroyed it. And the first thing it did when it started to go bye-bye was, let's see, here's some rockers. Did it break a rocker? Something crazy started happening with the valve train, and a push rod popped out, let loose, clutch in, car coasted to stop. And so now you have a multi-million-dollar paperweight that no one is going to pay you that for. It's basically worthless. It really is. It's basically worthless. It's a big, heavy ornament right now. And the engine's shot. So my thinking was this. I was thinking about it, and it's been sitting here at Genius Garage for some time. And putting it back to the original motor is silly. Like, the amount of time and effort it takes to do that, not to mention money that I could apply to the students a lot better than doing that, it doesn't make sense. And when I think about rebuilding this particular Chevy and setup, it's overly complex for no reason. There's a great learning opportunities here for students, but at the same time, too, you want them to go down a path where they're going to be successful, not chasing their tail with something ridiculous. And this motor is made for something that revs higher. So we've got this worthless car that has all this beautiful engineering in it. So my idea was, this is totally doable. Let's get this really zoomy small block Chevy out of there with all the VTEC electronics, and let's pickle that. Put it on the corner for Genius Garage for later. Maybe build our own supercar, because it's gasoline, and this is a wicked motor, absolute wicked motor. I'll see if I can dig up the dyno run of it. But if we utilize this for something else, for Genius Garage doing a really cool project, then we just strip this thing back down to being a rolling chassis. And a rolling chassis Indy car like this is not worth a whole lot. It's worth... It's not worth much. Let me put it that way. It's basically just art. But it's got all this great technology in it. So my thought was this. Why don't we make this utilizable for track days? The other difficulty is, even if it's functioning perfectly, with making as much power in it requires a very athletic and worthwhile driver to do it well. Even at speeds that are off a race or qualifying pace, it still requires somebody that's spot on. There's no magic to driving it, but it is seriously precise, like, basically trying to rip a fighter jet through a canyon or something. So my thought was the S2000 motor, Honda S2000. People are going to lose their minds when I say this, but that thing in a production car revs to 9,000 RPMs with a timing chain, I believe. That's interesting. And it makes the better part of 250 horsepower, which pales in comparison to the 840 this thing makes. But here's where I'm going with it. This car, even with that Chevy engine being heavy, with actually I believe this one has an iron block, believe it or not, still it comes in at like 1,700 pounds with no driver. That's pretty light. So you ditch all this malarkey and you put an S2000 motor in it, you're gonna be down even further. So let's pretend it weighs like 14 or 1450, all buttoned up, ready to go, with the stock S2000 making 250 horsepower. It's still going to be a formidable track day car, and one that doesn't require an absurd level of driving talent to have, just a reasonable amount of driving talent on the track. So if you open it up to where other people can theoretically drive it in a, safely in a reasonable area like that, and you make something more rock solid reliable that costs so much less to run and is inherently safer, then you now have a great platform to test with, or even just driver development practice if you're doing other things with Genius Garage. And you've got something with the timing chain and with the nature of being gasoline and such. If it sits for longer periods of time, the only thing that really start going bad quickly are the tires and the fuel bladder, which isn't that bad. The other thing that's nice about putting in like a VTEC S2000 motor, it's a smaller motor, so the radiators and oil coolers in this that were designed originally for a methanol burning engine of a lot more horsepower are still going to be adequate or more than adequate for that smaller motor, where a gasoline burning Chevy like this cooling system is barely cutting the mustard. And we'd have to frankly open it up for more flow and whatnot. So instead of letting this car go the direction that makes no sense, I'm kind of posing it to you guys, but I've thought about this. I think we should put in an S2000 motor and make that work. Now, all you smart people are now going to lose your minds and wanting to type all the things that are wrong with that. But let's work through the big ones. First of all, an S2000 motor is not really something you should make a stressed motor. The architecture was really not designed for that. It's also wet sump, so there's a lot of distance between the crankshaft to the ground. Those are two problems for the Indy car, because one, this was designed to have a fully stressed member that bolts with big pins into the monocoque at the bottom and on the sides where the valve covers are, and then to the bell housing of this transaxle here. The small block Chevy is largely stressed or partially stressed in this, and you can get away with it. And part of the reason you get away with it is there's these big chromoly tubes right here, they come back, that attach to the bell housing, and you can't see them because they're buried, but there's also chromoly tubes, I know this because I made them, that go on the bottom of the bell housing to the front. So that helps get rid of a lot, and then the Chevy only has to do much in torsion. There were no issues in testing with doing issues with the bearings or spinning the bearings or warping it. It was good. But an S2000 motor is not that robust, okay? So the positive, though, is it's narrow. So that allows the ability in these side pods and whatnot to be able to build structure that comes back to this that will be adequate for the job. The other thing that's nice about the S2000 motor is people build those things for a lot of power, whether you're doing things from the crank to con rods to the pistons and doing forced induction, which everybody does in their performance car. So let's say you do a mild race build forced induction on that S2000 motor and you're only making like 450 horsepower, 500 horsepower. 450, 500 horsepower in a 1,400 pound car with this much downforce is a freaking rocket ship. And you're not going to compete in the modern Indy series with it, you're just going to do vintage stuff. And there's really nothing wrong with that. And even if the vintage racing organization stuck their nose up at it because it didn't have the original, you can still do great track days and use it as a test vehicle for engineering research and stuff. And frankly, I think it's a really cool idea. Now, let's talk about the issue with it, S2000 being a wet sump and the high G loading, as well as the spatial considerations. One major issue with putting a different engine into an IndyCar champ car like this is this thing was originally designed with an engine that was, of course, dry sump with a smaller stroke. And man, that thing was slammed so far, right down to the belly pan. We're talking like this high off the ground. The crankshaft, you measured it to the ground in an original car, is probably like this from where it spins. And because of that, the input shaft to the transmission is insanely low. Also, in the bell housing, there is literally only enough room for a clutch this big around, like a 5.5 inch clutch. That's it. Nothing else. You're not getting a flywheel. It was not designed for that. So, an S2000 motor, you could do it, but it would have to be converted to dry sump, and you'd probably have to make a custom pan, so one, it could be slammed down there. There's plenty of room to put in a auxiliary oil pump and scavenging pumps, and it already has a great sump tank built in up in there that would work. The other thing nice about the S2000 motor, it's a little shorter, so you still have room to run the V-ribbed belt up in there for your alternator, which is very important, and the water pump, so you don't have to run the electrical water pump like in this, and that all just works nicely. And that's a good thing. So your biggest thing comes down to just spatial consideration and structure. You'll probably have to machine your own thin flywheel that then connects to the clutch that works in this, because of the nature of the splines, which isn't the most hateful thing in the world. And if I'm not mistaken, the S2000 clutch stock is a little over 11 inches in diameter to the teeth, which is nice because that, I think, is just enough room, distance-wise, being like 5.5 inches from the center line of the input shaft on the transaxle, that even if you had to have the flywheel be exposed a little bit on the bottom, it wouldn't be so big as that you couldn't run the stock or stock diameter flywheel. And a stock starter, yes, onboard starter, because it goes on the engine side, not on the bell housing side, which would be really nice because even if you don't have a giant battery in it that turns it over that easily, you can always plug in an auxiliary battery and then you can get rid of that cart. The other thing nice about an S2000 motor, even at slightly different racing tolerances if you build it, and most especially production ones, you don't have to worry about pre-warming it or anything. And then you just have to be nice to the transaxle. That thing revs to 9 grand. It's not going to make the same power as the INDY CAR motor or this motor does. So you're always going to have enough gear ratio no matter what speed you go, because this makes a heck of a lot of drag, okay, at a road course. And you probably would never put the Speedway wings back on. But the gearbox is going to be just fine. And this transverse gearbox is a little more delicate than the longitudinal ones from before. And the example is, and one of the biggest problems with running a Chevy in this particular car with this particular gearbox, if you want to come have a quick little look here, is how to start it. Because all these gears are transverse. In the one before, like I said, they were longitudinal. And in the one before, you'd leave the clutch out. And here's the big starter motor right here, guys. Let me take this out. I mean, this thing is a monster. This thing will spin over a high compression small block Chevy to like 1,100, 1,200 RPMs. Going directly into the back of it. I mean, it is brutal how it goes in there. Well, on the older transaxle, when you put this in, this would literally plug in, and if you look down here, you can see the tiny connector, and this one has an auxiliary shaft that when you push it, I'll try to push it here, watch. See how I push it? That engages some little gears into basically what goes directly into the motor. So when that's pushed in there like that, and you hit this button with power supplied to it, it's going to turn it over lightning quick. Problem is, that is a tiny starter shaft because with it being transverse, you can't just plug it into the one of the main shafts of the gearbox. On the longitudinal ones, and that's where I'm beating around the bush, you literally plug in to the big shaft of the gears in the back. And why that's better is, that way it didn't break. This one has a stupid little tiny spindly shaft with these tiny little gears in the gearbox, and even way back in the day originally, they would sometimes break. And if you break it, there's a stupid little gear that breaks off in the bottom of this transaxle and you're done. Not only is it not racing for that moment, you got to surgically go in the side of the transaxle, maybe even tip the car and get it out and install a new one. It's not pleasant. So, I mean, this is a really nice gearbox, but the starter sucks. The starter would probably work fine for a smaller engine like what is an S2000 if it was less drag than the big Chevy, of course, but it would be ideal if you could just have an onboard starter and plug it in and make it simpler so you can actually do something with a car like this in modern days. And I know that right now, there's a million people out there right now that think I'm blasphemous and loony and you can't do that and it's a bad idea for a million reasons. But I would just say this. One, have you ever done that? Have you ever worked on these things? Please relax, okay? I'm not just talking out my, my posterior, okay? But the difficulty with cars like this is, it's such a shame no one can do anything with them. I mean, there's Indy cars rotting all over America because nobody can do anything with them. I've seen a couple of guys take like an IRL car from the 2000s and put in like an LS or something and jack up the suspension and put DOT tires on it and the license plate and kind of drive it around. But it's sort of a worthless car. I mean, it's fun, but it's a hot rod. And people might say, why would you go to all that trouble to do that when you can just go out and buy a Formula Atlantic car? That's a great point. Formula Atlantic car weighs less. It has a 4-cylinder engine in it. You can buy some older ones like a Swift or something if you get a really good deal for like $30,000 or $40,000 running, and it's a fast car. It's a great car, great driver development, a lot of fun, but they're high strung and they're kind of delicate. These things are all around and they're robust and tough, and they were made to take crashes at 250 miles an hour and you'll probably walk away. So they're tough and robust and great. And the thing that would be neat is if you can find an engine that a package that works in it, that's a no-brainer, that can go lots of hours without ever being rebuilt or ever taking out, and it's not going to blow up, and all this robust stuff, you have a great track car. So that's what I'm thinking right now, you guys. I think that all of this expensive electronics and all this stuff that, quite frankly, is worth something on this car, including this motor, should come out and go to some crazy cool Genius Garage race car or supercar project. And what's left of the rolling chassis, which funny is the part that's not really worth that much. The engine's worth more than this car. I'm not even kidding. Together, if they worked really well, it'd be worth something, but the thing in this is worth the most is the engine and electronics, as is. But I think this would be a really neat project and something to do with, and right now I'm leaning hard towards basing it with what was the Honda S2000 engine. There's lots of builders, lots of performance parts for them. It'd fit, it'd sound good, it'd be cool, so why not? VTEC swap an Indy car. Anyway, I look forward to hear your comments on it. This is just food for thought. Maybe I should go and try to yank this side pod off for you really quick. But yeah, it was an idea that kind of came to me after this car has been sitting, frankly, for a couple of years. And the reason it was sitting, I mean, it's a great car, but it just requires so much money thrown at it to do anything with it. And it's a shame because there's such great engineering here and opportunity, but it's basically just rotting because you can't do anything with it. And frankly, I would really like Genius Garage to have a world-class formula car for the students to be able to learn from for modern motorsports. But in that sense, I'm thinking about, in the future, seeing about getting a like a GP2 car, which is basically like a slightly tamed down F1 car. Stop, get off there, you. Slightly tamed down modern F1 car. I'd love to have a Cosworth DFV powered Formula One car for the students so they can go do the Masters Historic Grand Prix and be around for the support races for modern F1. But you guys can see how much room. This is the underpan basically. This is your wing surface on the bottom. Obviously everything's well packaged in here. You got water radiator and the oil cooler. This is a little different than original. They wouldn't normally have a fan on it, but the people that worked on this before us put a fan. It's kind of cool. You can pressurize the oil system right here with a drill and have a spin-on filter, which is easy and nice, but just really great Motec throughout. Of course, there's the engine and how buried it is, but it's such abysmal to work on. It really is if anything goes wrong. I mean, this is all like military spec, modern racing, awesome, but it just, I think this car went the wrong direction. So I'm thinking the best thing to do is take out all of the nice electronics, take out that crazy over-the-top 11-degree Chevy with the individual throttle bodies on EFI, yank that all out, set that aside for an awesome Genius Garage car project in the future, maybe your own prototype or something like that. But in the meantime, maybe this neat IndyCar or Champ Car roller should have a VTEC swap. So I hope you guys will share this. Naturally, like, comment, and of course, subscribe. See you guys next time.